The fog sits low over Coronado at 5:30 a.m., thick enough to beat on skin and bite the lungs with salt. Diesel hangs in the air from generators along the Naval Special Warfare Center fence as lights hum awake across the training grounds. Lieutenant Emily Carter holds parade rest on the edge of the obstacle field. NWU Type 3 crisp at the seams, and Bates boots scuff to the leather. She keeps her chin level and her shoulders square, breathing slow to match the ocean's rhythm beyond the berm. Master Chief Blake Turner stands a few steps away with Lieutenant Commander Mark Ellis. Their voices easy as they trade small talk that skirts her presence. They face the course, not her, as if the air between ranks can swallow a person whole. 18 BUD and S trainees fight the mud pit below. Shoulders slick, helmets spotted with grit. Emily watches the line of bodies surge and stall, then marks in her notebook where hurried feet load the toes and drag balance forward until scanning dies into target fixation. Another candidate muscles a rope wall with raw arms instead of using his hips. She notes energy wasted and the way his eyes lock on the center, a sign that posture is steering perception more than any plan. Fundamentals first, always. Her fingers drift to the skin behind her left ear where a compass rose sits small and hidden. The touch steadies her like a metronome, the same way pressure at the base of her neck quiets a tremor. Under the blouse, a shrapnel scar pulls tight in the cold. Turner and Ellis keep talking around her, a slow current that never breaks the surface. Emily lets the silence pass, letting discipline sit where pride wants to speak, and keeps tracking movement patterns as the class grinds through another lap. The sun lifts a pale seam over the bay and the radios crackle alive for the next evolution. A shoothouse drill with Simunition is on the board, and the glass booth will not be the only place she stands today. Emily Carter grew up in 29 Palms, a desert town where heat shimmers above asphalt. Her family lived 2 miles from the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center, close enough to hear artillery on training nights. Her father, a gunnery sergeant in the United States Marine Corps, carried himself with a quiet edge that meant business. He taught discipline as routine and responsibility as promise, and the house kept a base schedule. At 9 she learned to shoot a .22 on a dusty berm, breathing slow and steady. By 12 she could field strip an M16, a 4 in the dark. And at home, the rule was, do it right. When she looked toward service, her father said the Marine Corps would grind her down while the Navy would teach her to think. She listened, weighed pride against purpose, and chose the C uniform so her mind could be sharpened first. Her Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery score came back high, and she entered training as an intelligence specialist. Soon she held top-secret and sensitive compartmented information access and sat in Joint Task Force briefings, where people used call signs and left names at the door. Her days belonged to patterns, stitching satellite images to fragments of signals until a picture of intent took shape. She built target packages with measured hands, knowing every arrow on a map could change a street, a family, a night. Patience followed her like a shadow, because accuracy was not a flourish. It was obligation daily. When decisions left the room, she felt their weight, and she carried it without complaint because the work touched lives she would never meet. Somewhere downrange a city waited with alleys too narrow for mistakes, and she could feel the pull long before orders arrived. Everything she had learned in classrooms and vaults would soon be dragged into daylight, and the test would not care how ready she felt. The order put Lieutenant Emily Carter in Mosul in October, embedded as an intelligence liaison with a joint task force conducting sensitive site exploitation. The target house looked ordinary until the breach. The team stepped into a prepared kill zone, and the interpreter went down in the opening seconds. Rules of engagement were tight and the streets were crowded, so no aircraft came overhead. With civilians stacked in every alley, air support was off the table and the radios grew careful. The team collapsed to the second floor while fighters held the first floor and the roof. Quick reaction force help stalled behind approval chains and arguments over who owned the battle space. That left a staircase, a hallway, and a thin margin to stay alive. Emily worked comms and eyes, passing what she heard and saw, keeping the picture honest. Her Arabic was functional, enough to catch intent when voices below began coordinating toward the American woman. She relayed the threat calmly and shifted to help manage sectors, keeping muzzles off friendlies and angles clean. Light discipline and positive identification mattered more than speed. Fire grew and ammunition thinned. Petty Officer First Class Jason Reed took a round that punched near the edge of his plate and tore the subclavian artery. The corpsman pressed hard with gauze and agents, but bleeding under the clavicle laughed at hands. Reed pushed his HK 416 over to Emily because she carried only a Beretta M9. She settled behind the sight line, covered the corridor with disciplined pairs, and let geometry do work while others moved. Every shot had to be earned. No overpenetration. No panic. Hours stacked until the house felt smaller than a closet. 11 hours of stairwell checks, dry magazines, and decisions no one wanted to own settled into her bones. Fear visited often, but duty stayed, and duty kept the door from opening the wrong way. Reed's grip cooled while the street finally quieted. 4 teammates did not come home. And weeks later, a small compass rose, went behind her left ear to hold their directions. That night planted the choice to teach at Naval Special Warfare Center, to integrate intelligence and tactical support so others might stand longer than she did. The orders pinned Lieutenant Emily Carter to Coronado and the Naval Special Warfare Center, where her billet read instructor for intelligence integration and tactical support. The morning brief started at 8 a.m. in a room that smelled like coffee and dry erase markers, the kind of place where tempo begins. Master Chief Blake Turner handled introductions with efficient words that skimmed the surface of her experience. He called her intelligence background and moved on, while Lieutenant Commander Mark Ellis listened with a careful posture that said he was still making up his mind. Emily stood parade rest near the back wall. Uniform, neat, notebook ready. The rhythm of meetings was familiar, so she let the room breathe while she watched faces and heard what was not said. When the brief shifted to training evolutions, Senior Chief Alan Briggs walked her through simunition procedures for the shoot house with a patient tone that edged toward condescension. He described blue tip marking rounds, protective gear, and safe angles as if she had never seen a stack enter a door. Communications policy followed. Her radio was issued on monitor only for the range safety officer net, and a neutral safety observer would log each evolution to preserve range integrity, response times, and corrective actions. After the brief, she moved to the obstacle field and took a position on the berm, page open to a fresh line. 18 Bud and S trainees churned through mud and rope, helmets low, breathing hard enough to fog the cool air. She tracked fundamentals like a coach behind glass. Too much weight on the toes led to a forward fall and target fixation, while a narrow base turned every step into a wobble that killed any clean scan. A candidate tried to pull the rope wall with arms alone, shoulders burning before the halfway point. Emily noted the missed hip drive and wrote that raw strength hides bad mechanics until it fails. Turner and Ellis spoke a few steps away, their conversation touching weather and schedules while avoiding her completely. Emily let the slight pass and kept working because the mission was the students and the standard, not the room. By the time the sun pushed a pale stripe over the bay, range control was calling the next block. A shoot-house drill with simunition sat on the board, and Emily knew the glass would not be the only place where she belonged today. The shoot-house wakes with a pop of simunition and the thump of boots on plywood. Master Chief Blake Turner runs the line as primary range safety officer, while Senior Chief Alan Briggs moves as downrange safety, eyes fixed on hands and muzzles. Lieutenant Commander Mark Ellis watches from the control room as a neutral safety observer, logs every call and correction. Lieutenant Emily Carter stands behind ballistic glass with a notebook and a radio set to monitor only on the RSO net. The brief was clean and the lanes are hot. 2 BUD and S candidates stack on a metal door that breathes noise into the hallway. On the go signal, the point man surges through without slicing the pie. He drives past the threshold, misses the 90-degree corner, and tunnels on a center target. The number 2 follows his wake and doubles the mistake. Emily tracks the angle instead of the person. She sees weight dump into the toes, shoulders pitched forward, eyes pulled to the middle as balance searches for a catch. Target identification gets shaky when posture writes the script. For safety, she requests permission to switch to the instructor to RSO net. Ellis nods from the control room, and range control clears the handoff. She keeps it short and strictly technical, calling stance as the root cause and recommending a stable platform to restore a clean scan. Turner answers first, and his voice closes the loop. Observation booth is for observing lieutenant. The net returns to standard, and the run finishes under watchful guns. Ceasefire comes and the room resets. Briggs checks hits with a paint tally, while Turner reiterates angles and safe sectors. Emily writes the sequence in tight lines and tags the entry with cause. Effect. Correction. The next pair does better. The point man leans less, and the 90 opens like a door should. White light finds the threat without dragging the muzzle across a friendly lane. The day keeps its rhythm until the shooter's secure and the radios go quiet. Emily files her notes and leaves the catwalk as the sun dies over the bay. The locker room later carries low voices that circle a plan to push her into a validation and let the result embarrass itself. She ties her boots for the second time and says nothing to the tiles. The only answer she keeps is pace and preparation. Morning will ask its own questions. The weekly coordination meeting opened with a flat agenda and a room of tired faces. Master Chief Blake Turner added a new line that carried weight. A validation for instructors meant to standardize skills and protect students from uneven teaching. He outlined 4 events and tied each to clear safety rationale. The goal was a single bar for everyone who would stand in front of a class and speak with authority. Land navigation would lead, up in the low hills east of Coronado. Candidates would use a topographic map, a protractor, and a lensatic compass with no GPS allowed, hitting 8 points inside a strict clock. A timed shoot house package would follow. The lane used an M4 training replica firing Simunition with 4 30-round magazines, iron sights, and white light, under primary range safety officer control, while a neutral safety observer logged every action for traceability. The next block was tactical combat casualty care. The rubric followed march with needle decompression at the 5th intercostal space at the anterior axillary line using a 14-gauge 3.25-inch catheter. Combat application tourniquet, high and tight with time marked, and hypothermia prevention with a thermal barrier. It would close with a 12-mile ruck at roughly 15 minutes per mile while carrying a ruck of about 65 pounds. A plate carrier with SAPI plates, a duty belt, and hydration. The standard was not meant to impress anyone, only to prove that instructors could endure what they asked others to do. Lieutenant Emily Carter accepted the packet with a calm nod and no comment. She checked map declination against the printed margin, synced watches for a clean time hack, and tested the bezel on her compass until the clicks felt honest. On the comm side, she confirmed her radio permissions and staged an AN or PRC 152 for the 9-line Medevac call that would be folded into the ruck lane. She labeled her index card with the lines and left blanks for grid and precedence to avoid sloppy recall when tired. Turner watched with the quiet expectation that fatigue would do his work for him. Emily packed, repacked, and signed the range safety sheet as if routine could blunt the edge of bias. The process would be clean, the nets would be disciplined, and the standard would be met or missed in daylight. The hills east of Coronado rise in folds that hide small mistakes. Lieutenant Emily Carter receives a topo map with a clean grid and a protractor edge that still shows factory ink. She confirms magnetic declination on the margin and sets a crisp azimuth for point 1. Her radio stays for emergencies only, and GPS is not authorized. A neutral safety observer notes the start time and records that 8 checkpoints must be punched inside 4 hours. She sets a pace count with a marker knot and calls a time hack at 7:10 a.m. The first leg runs along a shallow draw littered with shale. Loose rock slides underfoot and the coastal scrub tugs at her pants with every stride. She keeps cadence steady and checks contour lines against the ground to verify the route. Checkpoint 1 sits near a saddle that is easy to overrun. She confirms position by terrain association, reads the spur to the south, and punches the card. Azimuth for point 2 is adjusted 2 degrees to compensate for drift over the slope. The climb to checkpoint 3 feels simple until a slick patch turns her ankle a quarter roll. She arrests the stumble with a pole plant and breathes until the joint quiets. Pace count is amended and the notebook gets one tight correction. Point 4 is a short leg that crosses a ridge with a false crest. She uses a backstop trail as a safety feature and drifts left with intention to avoid gullies that drink time. The punch clicks and the clock stays friendly. Coordinates for checkpoint 5 do not match the world by about 200 meters. She proves the error with resection, taking bearings on 2 distinct features and fixing the intersection on the map. The revised azimuth walks her cleanly into the thicket that hides the stake. 6 and 7 run across side hills that burn calves and patience. She watches the line of march and keeps the compass housing level so the needle does not lie. The observer logs her split times as steady despite the grade. Checkpoint 8 sits beyond a brushy swale where distance feels longer than it measures. She pushes through, punches the card, and steps off toward the finish with a final bearing. 3 hours 42 minutes later, Turner marks the sheet without comment. She takes 15 minutes to hydrate and eat, then drains a hot spot and tapes the fresh blister. Boots are laced again and the pack cinches tight. The next evolution is waiting and the margin for error is smaller now. The hostage lane is set as 3 connected rooms with clear rules for target discrimination and no tolerance for civilian hits. Master Chief Blake Turner controls the range as primary range safety officer, while Senior Chief Alan Briggs walks the walls as downrange safety. Lieutenant Commander Mark Ellis watches from the control room beside a neutral safety observer who logs every command and time mark. Lieutenant Emily Carter stands at the threshold with an M4 training replica loaded with Simunition blue tip and 430-round magazines. She runs a press check, confirms iron sights and white light, then settles her breath in a 4 count in and 6 count out. The metal door carries sound through the frame, so she treats it like a sensor more than an obstacle. On the buzzer, she slices the pie and lets the angles feed information instead of guesswork. The muzzle tracks with her eyes and her feet stay quiet enough to hear movement inside. Room 1 opens to 2 threats. One at 9 o'clock tucked behind a table and one at 2 o'clock standing open. She presses controlled pairs to center mass on each and flows past the threshold without overcommitting. Room 2 holds a single civilian on the deck with empty hands and wide eyes. She identifies non-combatant, holds white light off the face, and keeps the muzzle indexed to a safe sector while moving. Room 3 is the problem. A hostage sits in a chair with zip ties while a role player stands tight with a training knife at the throat. Emily works right to create separation until the geometry opens a safe lane. The front sight settles, and a single round ends the threat without risking the hostage. She secures the room, cuts restraints, and builds a clean path out while checking sectors. The extract runs like a checklist, and the control room clock stops at 47 seconds. Turner acknowledges the time and calls the line cold, with no change in tone. Ellis keeps his eyes on the monitors as the neutral safety observer finishes the log. Emily safes her weapon and steps off the lane with steady hands and a steady heart rate. Technique has done the talking, and the next test is already waiting. An outdoor training lane waits with 3 simulated casualties on marked mats under a pale sky. Lieutenant Emily Carter approaches with gloves ready in mind on march. The goal is stability inside 10 minutes. Using clear priorities and clean communication, she checks scene safety, announces care under fire concluded, and moves to tactical field care. Massive bleeding gets the first look. A quick sweep finds no arterial spray, so she turns to airway and respiration while maintaining lane security overall. The first patient has asymmetric chest rise and diminished breath sounds on the right. Emily recognizes likely tension pneumothorax. She locates fifth intercostal space at the anterior axillary line, disinfects, and advances a 14-gauge 25-inch catheter over rib. Air vents with a soft hiss and effort eases. She reassesses lung sounds, notes better expansion, and secures the hub without kinking. Oxygen saturation climbs now on the monitor, and the patient speaks in shorter, calmer phrases between controlled breaths. The second patient bleeds from a lower leg that soaks gauze fast. Emily applies a combat application tourniquet high and tight above the injury, twists the windlass until pulse is absent, and notes the time on the strap. Bleeding stops. She checks for secondary bleeds, ensures the tourniquet is not over a joint, and rescans for hidden wounds. A dressing reinforces the seal and she shields the limb. Hypothermia gets attention with a thermal blanket because cold blood clots poorly. The third patient shows pale skin, weak pulse, and mentation consistent with hypovolemic shock. Emily maintains the airway with a jaw thrust, monitors respirations, and elevates the legs only if breathing allows. She controls residual bleeding and reassures with cadence. She cycles through March again and documents interventions with times and responses. Vital signs are rechecked, mental status recorded, and she prepares 9-line Medevac data on a card. Grid, precedence, equipment, and pickup methods stay blank for ruck lane. The watch reads 9:50 a.m. as the last check's complete, and the line chief calls time. All 3 casualties are stable within the 10-minute standard. The primary range safety officer signs while the neutral observer closes the log. The 12-mile ruck starts on pavement before it gives way to dirt and scrub. Lieutenant Emily Carter shoulders about 65 pounds in her ruck with a plate carrier fitted with sappy plates, a duty belt, and a full hydration system. Her pace settles near 15 minutes per mile as the course leaves the road. Master Chief Blake Turner and Lieutenant Commander Mark Ellis follow in a vehicle about 50 meters back, while Senior Chief Alan Briggs walks as safety and a neutral observer log splits. Hot spots bloom on her heels and turn into blisters by mile 3. She shortens stride to protect the skin and lets the clock be the only argument she answers. By mile 4, her vision narrows at the edges and noise falls away to breath and footfall. She keeps a metronomic inhale and exhale, counting steps to hold cadence when thought gets slow. Mile 7 brings a small wave of nausea that threatens to tip her off rhythm. She swallows it back, sips water on schedule, and keeps the ruck straps even, so the weight does not saw her shoulders raw. At mile 10, the vehicle noses ahead, and Turner flags a halt. He assigns a left deviation of about half a kilometer through brush to locate a simulated casualty and conduct a rapid march assessment. Emily plots a bearing off the map edge and moves into scrub that clutches at her shins. She finds the dummy in full kit, confirms airway and breathing, checks for massive hemorrhage, and then preps a 9-line on an ANPRC 152. She reads each line cleanly, pauses for a correction on the grid, and transmits the revised coordinate without hesitation. With acknowledgement received, the task shifts to casualty evacuation to the vehicle. She rigs a hasty drag harness from 550 cord and starts pulling. The brush steals momentum and the ground tilts just enough to punish ankles. But she keeps the spine straight and protects the airway as the minutes stack. 41 minutes later, she hits the trail again, with hands abraded and legs trembling. Turner issues the order to finish and the vehicle rolls back as she turns into the final 2 miles. The last stretch belongs to muscle memory. She walks like a metronome until the orange cone rises and passes. Then she stands still long enough to hear her pulse in her ears. No one fills the silence that follows. The log sheet gets another time, and the trail holds the rest of the story for whoever needs to read it next. She finishes the last 2 miles on autopilot, feet drumming out a steady count that ignores pain. The orange cone comes and goes, and she keeps walking 3 steps before the world remembers to stop. She folds to a seated crouch and breathes shallow to keep her stomach quiet. Heat leaves her face in waves and then returns. Hands on knees. She lets the pulse slow enough to hear wind beyond the berm. The taste of metal fades to salt. Master Chief Blake Turner steps close with a clipboard and a measured verdict that sounds like pass at the minimum. The strap of her plate carrier slips as she wipes sweat, and the edge reveals a puckered scar along the left shoulder. It is the sort of wound training does not make. Lieutenant Commander Mark Ellis sees the pattern before words find it. A blast. A vehicle packed with explosives. And a night that ran 11 hours with 4 who never came home. The silence between them tightens until it says everything. Emily touches the small compass rose behind her left ear, the way a musician finds tempo. The gesture settles her and pulls the room into focus. The scar is only a record, but the promise attached to it is the point. In her mind, she lays out the reason she is here. Teach the next generation and honor the men who asked her to make them better. Approval is not in the requirement. Turner studies the ground and then looks up with a different set to the jaw. Respect replaces the edge. Dry and unadorned. Ellis nods once, not in pity, but in recognition of work already done. Emily stands and lifts her ruck without help. Breath evens out as the vehicle door closes and range control wraps the lane. Monday's debrief is set for 8 a.m., and she will be there early. She walks off under a thin sky that finally remembers to be blue. The trail is quiet again, and the day grows small behind her. There is more to teach. The coordination brief starts at 8 a.m. in a room that smells like dry erase and strong coffee. Master Chief Blake Turner meets the eyes in the room, then names Lieutenant Emily Carter as primary instructor for intelligence integration and tactical support. The tasking is plain. The responsibilities are listed, and the meeting moves on without ceremony. 3 weeks later, the shoot house runs on schedule, and the air tastes of paint from Simunition. Turner halts a lane after a forward-leaning stance shows up again in a BUD and S trainee. He asks Emily for the assessment, then repeats her correction on the radio in clear safety language and ties it to the training objective. Between those days, Turner pulls the full after-action report from Mosul through proper channels. He reads every annex and timeline, and the picture closes gaps that rumor never can. When he speaks to Emily, he keeps it simple and owns the earlier judgment as incomplete information. Nothing more. The change is not loud. It shows up in how feedback is delivered, in who is asked to brief, and in the way questions travel across the table. Respect replaces friction because performance has removed the need for anything else. 10 days after the brief, orders arrive that make Emily a permanent instructor for a minimum 2-year rotation. The package carries a written recommendation from Turner, concurrence from Lieutenant Commander Mark Ellis, and approval by the commanding officer. The message is clear that this is about capability and trust, not pity. Emily files the orders and checks the next week's schedule with a steady hand. The lane will be ready, the students will be ready, and so will she. The work continues because that is what the standard requires. The temporary officer room is quiet enough to hear the air vent hum. A small stack of NWU Type 3 uniforms sits folded on the chair, and a sea bag waits untouched by the door. Lieutenant Emily Carter sets her orders flat on the desk and lets the paper cool. The words permanent instructor feel simple and heavy at the same time. The photograph rests beside a pen and a blank notebook. Petty Officer First Class Jason Reed stands there with 3 teammates who did not come home. She touches the compass rose behind her left ear and counts a slow breath. Memory settles, not as ache, but as direction. Tomorrow will bring another line of BUD and S trainees to the catwalk. There will be mistakes worth fixing and effort worth naming. She pictures the shoot house lanes and the first door that eats confidence. Stance first. Platform stable. Eyes free to scan. Geometry before speed. White light belongs on information, not on a face. Angles open when feet are honest and muzzles stay disciplined. Her mind walks through the cadence of a 9-line Medevac for when fatigue makes vowels blur. Location, precedence, equipment, patient count, security, method, nationality, terrain, remarks, Then, the march sequence returns like a checklist she could run in the dark. Massive bleeding, airway, respiration, circulation, hypothermia prevention. Each step steady and verified. The room carries the smell of detergent and dust, and something like calm. She lets the quiet have a minute. Emily looks once more at Reed and the three who guide her compass. Teaching well is the only repayment that makes sense. She turns off the light and the window softens to a square of night. One deep breath and the promise feels alive again. Morning will ask for patience and standards and the same steady voice. She will start at the beginning, as many times as it takes.